The Untold Story: How Russia Built the Case to Ban Jehovah's Witnesses. In 2017, Russia made a decision that shocked the world, but that almost no one truly understands. A decision that transformed a peaceful religious group into extremists. A stroke of the pen that closed kingdom halls, confiscated properties, destroyed entire congregations, and placed thousands of people at risk of imprisonment. But this was not an isolated act. It was not an accident. It was not a spontaneous reaction. The ban on Jehovah's Witnesses was the final chapter of a much longer story, a story that began years earlier, built step by step, silently, behind the scenes of the Kremlin. Today, we're going back to the beginning. We're going to reveal how it all started, what led an entire government to place a religious group on the list of extremists, and perhaps most disturbingly, how this decision paved the way for everything that happened afterward. What you're about to see is the story no one has told. The Untold Story: How Russia Built the Case to Ban Jehovah's Witnesses. In 2017, Russia made a decision that shocked the world, but that almost no one truly understands. A decision that transformed a peaceful religious group into extremists. A stroke of the pen that closed kingdom halls, confiscated properties, destroyed entire congregations, and placed thousands of people at risk of imprisonment. But this was not an isolated act. It was not an accident. It was not a spontaneous reaction. The ban on Jehovah's Witnesses was the final chapter of a much longer story, a story that began years earlier, built step by step, silently, behind the scenes of the Kremlin. Today, we're going back to the beginning. We're going to reveal how it all started, what led an entire government to place a religious group on the list of extremists, and perhaps most disturbingly, how this decision paved the way for everything that happened afterward. What you're about to see is the story no one has told. To understand what happened in 2017, you need to understand the weapon that made it possible. Russia's law on combating extremist activity is one of the most flexible, most vague, and most politically useful pieces of legislation in the country's legal arsenal. Passed in 2002, ostensibly to combat terrorism and hate crimes, the law quickly evolved into something far more expansive and far more concerning. The definition of extremism under Russian law is deliberately broad. It can include incitement to hatred, calls for violence, attempts to undermine state security, or activities that threaten territorial integrity. So far, so reasonable, at least on paper. But the law also includes vaguer provisions about actions that demonstrate disrespect for society, or that aim to incite religious discord, or that involve creating organizations whose activities are directed at the liquidation or restriction of rights on the basis of religious affiliation. These phrases sound serious, but they're elastic enough to stretch over almost any activity the government finds inconvenient. The beauty of such legislation, from an authoritarian perspective, is that it gives prosecutors and judges enormous discretion. Almost anything can be classified as extremist if the political will exists to do so. By the mid-2010s, this law had already been used against a wide range of targets. Political opposition groups found their pamphlets and websites labeled extremist. Minority religious organizations discovered that their sacred texts could be banned under extremist provisions. Even individual bloggers and social media users could face criminal prosecution for sharing the wrong meme or making the wrong comment online. The law was not really about combating genuine extremism. It was about control. It was about ensuring that no organization, no movement, no group of citizens could operate independently of state approval. And Jehovah's Witnesses, perhaps without fully realizing it, were the perfect target for this legal framework. Consider their characteristics from the Kremlin's perspective. Jehovah's Witnesses don't vote. In a system where political participation is carefully managed and where elections serve to demonstrate popular support for the regime, this non-participation is interpreted not as religious conviction but as political defiance. Witnesses refuse military service. In a country that takes immense pride in its military heritage and where conscription is a sacred civic duty, this refusal is seen as cowardice at best and treason at worst. They decline to honor national symbols. They won't salute the flag, they won't sing the anthem, they won't participate in patriotic celebrations. In an increasingly nationalist Russia, where loyalty to the motherland is paramount, this neutrality looks suspiciously like disloyalty. But perhaps most dangerous of all, from the state's perspective, is that Jehovah's Witnesses maintain their primary allegiance to a transnational organization headquartered in the United States. Their ultimate authority is not Moscow. It's not President Putin. It's not the Russian Orthodox Church, which has become deeply intertwined with state power. Their authority is the governing body in New York, and their kingdom is not of this world. For a government that demands complete loyalty, that seeks to control every aspect of civil society, that views any independent organization as a potential threat, this kind of dual allegiance is intolerable. The stage was set. The law existed. The target was identified. All that remained was to build the case, slowly and systematically, until the conclusion appeared not just justified but inevitable. During 2015 and 2016, if you were a Jehovah's Witness in Russia, you might have felt like the walls were slowly closing in. The pressure didn't come all at once. There was no dramatic announcement, no sudden crackdown. Instead, there was a steady, relentless increase in what could only be described as bureaucratic harassment. It started with inspections. Ministry of Justice officials would show up unannounced at kingdom halls, demanding to see registration documents, financial records, lists of members. They would scrutinize every piece of literature, every publication, every pamphlet. They were looking for violations, and in a system where the rules are deliberately vague and constantly changing, violations can always be found. Then came the legal proceedings. Congregations across Russia began receiving official notifications. Their literature had been examined, and certain publications had been deemed extremist. Sometimes it was a book. Sometimes it was a magazine article. Sometimes it was a biblical passage interpreted in a certain way. The specific accusation almost didn't matter because the process itself was the punishment. Each notification required a response, legal representation, hearings, appeals. The organization's resources were being drained fighting dozens, then hundreds, of small legal battles scattered across the vast Russian territory. Properties were confiscated. In some regions, local authorities would suddenly discover that a kingdom hall violated some obscure building code or zoning regulation. The congregation would be evicted, their property seized, their worship space eliminated. When they tried to meet in private homes, neighbors would report them. When they tried to conduct their ministry work, they would be stopped by police, questioned, sometimes detained. The message was clear. You are not welcome. Your faith is not acceptable. Your presence is a problem. This period, these 2 years of escalating pressure, served multiple purposes for the Russian government. On a practical level, it allowed them to gather documentation. Every inspection report, every court finding, every confiscated piece of literature became evidence for the larger case they were building. They were creating an extensive paper trail that would later be used to justify the complete ban. On a psychological level, the campaign wore down the witnesses themselves. Some left the country. Some stopped attending meetings. Some went underground, worshipping in secret. The visible presence of the organization diminished, making it easier to portray them as a fringe group, a marginal movement that wouldn't be missed. But perhaps most importantly, the 2-year squeeze allowed the government to normalize the persecution. By the time 2017 arrived, the idea that Jehovah's Witnesses were problematic was already widely accepted in Russia. The media had reported on the extremist literature findings. Local communities had been primed to view witnesses with suspicion. The Orthodox Church had publicly criticized them as a dangerous sect. The groundwork was complete. The case was ready. And in March of 2017, everything accelerated. March 24, 2017. For Jehovah's Witnesses around the world, this date would become seared into their collective memory. On this day, the Ministry of Justice of the Russian Federation filed an official petition with the Supreme Court. The request was extraordinary in its scope and devastating in its implications. The ministry was asking the court to suspend the activities of the Administrative Center of Jehovah's Witnesses in Russia, the central legal entity that coordinated all activities of the faith in the country. But they weren't stopping there. The petition also called for the liquidation of the Administrative Center and the liquidation of all 395 registered local religious organizations throughout Russia. The accusations laid out in the petition painted a picture of a dangerous extremist organization operating under the guise of religion. According to the ministry, Jehovah's Witnesses violated the rights of citizens, encouraged family breakups, promoted the refusal of medical treatment, encroached on the rights and freedoms of others, and most seriously, engaged in extremist activities. The evidence presented was a collection of court decisions from various regions where individual pieces of literature had been banned, incidents where witnesses had supposedly violated public order, and interpretations of their doctrines that portrayed them as intolerant and dangerous. What made this moment so critical was not just the severity of the accusations, but the speed with which events unfolded. Normally, cases of this magnitude take months or even years to wind through the Russian legal system. There are hearings, submissions, appeals, opportunities for the defense to present evidence and call witnesses. But this case was different. This case was fast-tracked. The Supreme Court agreed to hear the petition immediately. A date was set for April, less than a month away. And in the meantime, the suspension was put into effect immediately. With no trial, no opportunity to defend themselves, no due process, the Administrative Center of Jehovah's Witnesses ceased to exist as a legal entity in Russia. For the tens of thousands of witnesses in Russia, the news hit like a thunderbolt. Many couldn't believe it was happening. They were law-abiding citizens. They paid their taxes. They didn't protest, they didn't riot, they didn't engage in any kind of political activism. Their crime, if you could call it that, was simply believing differently and refusing to compromise on their religious convictions. But in Vladimir Putin's Russia, that was enough. The administrative suspension meant that overnight, everything the organization did became illegal. Holding meetings, even in private homes, was now a violation. Distributing literature was extremist activity. Even identifying yourself as one of Jehovah's Witnesses could potentially lead to criminal charges. The legal representatives of the witnesses scrambled to mount a defense. They filed objections, they prepared witnesses, they gathered documentation showing their charitable work, their community contributions, their decades of peaceful existence in Russia. But they were fighting against a tide that had already been set in motion. The decision had already been made at the highest levels of government. The court proceeding was not really about justice or truth. It was theater, a legal formality to provide a veneer of legitimacy to a political decision. And as April approached, everyone knew what the verdict would be. This is the date that defines everything. April 20th, 2017. The day when religious freedom in Russia died a little more. The day when a Supreme Court decision transformed 175,000 citizens into potential criminals. The day when persecution became policy. The hearing itself was brief, almost anticlimactic given the magnitude of what was at stake. The representatives of the Ministry of Justice presented their case, reiterating the accusations of extremism and danger to society. The lawyers for Jehovah's Witnesses argued that the accusations were baseless, that banning an entire religion violated Russia's constitution and international human rights obligations, that there was no evidence of violence or genuine extremism. They pointed out that Jehovah's Witnesses operate legally and peacefully in virtually every country in the world. They noted that the European Court of Human Rights had repeatedly ruled in favor of witnesses in cases involving religious freedom. None of it mattered. The panel of judges deliberated, and then delivered their ruling. The Administrative Center of Jehovah's Witnesses was to be liquidated. All 395 local religious organizations were to be dissolved. All properties belonging to these organizations were to be confiscated and transferred to the Russian state. And most crucially, the Supreme Court ruled that the faith itself would be banned. Any activity related to Jehovah's Witnesses, any gathering, any worship service, any attempt to practice or promote the faith, was now classified as continuing the activity of an extremist organization, a serious criminal offense under Russian law. Let that sink in for a moment. In one ruling, Russia had effectively outlawed a religion. Not because of any acts of violence, not because of any threat to public safety, not because of any actual extremism, but because the state had decided that this particular faith, with its emphasis on political neutrality and its refusal to grant ultimate allegiance to earthly governments, was incompatible with Putin's vision of a unified, orthodox, nationalistic Russia. The practical implications were immediate and devastating. As of that moment, the 2,909 kingdom halls scattered across Russia became illegal gathering places. The thousands of families who had worshipped together for decades were no longer allowed to meet. The circuit overseers, the elders, the ministerial servants, anyone who had any leadership role in the organization, was now potentially a criminal. The crime. Leading or participating in the activities of an extremist organization, which under Russian law carries penalties of up to 10 years in prison. But beyond the legal ramifications, there was a psychological and spiritual toll that's harder to quantify. Imagine being told that your deepest convictions, the faith that has guided your life, the community that has supported you through joy and hardship, is now classified in the same category as terrorist organizations. Imagine having to choose between obeying the law of the land and obeying what you believe to be the law of God. Imagine the fear of wondering whether a knock on your door might be the police coming to arrest you for praying with your family. The international response was swift and condemnatory. Human rights organizations denounced the decision. Foreign governments issued statements of concern. The United Nations Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Religion called it a violation of international law. But Russia didn't care. The decision stood. And as the shock began to wear off and the reality set in, Jehovah's Witnesses in Russia had to make an impossible choice. Flee the country, abandon their faith, or continue practicing in secret and risk everything. For a brief moment in the spring of 2017, there was hope. Hope that perhaps the ban was so extreme, so obviously unjust, that it wouldn't survive an appeal. Hope that cooler heads might prevail, that the international pressure might matter, that somehow sanity would be restored. That hope died on July 17, 2017. On that date, the appellate panel of the Russian Supreme Court convened to hear the appeal filed by Jehovah's Witnesses. The arguments were familiar by now. The witnesses' lawyers emphasized that the ban violated fundamental human rights, that it was based on a mischaracterization of their beliefs, that it created a dangerous precedent for all religious minorities in Russia. They presented expert testimony from religious scholars. They cited international law. They pointed to the complete absence of any evidence that Jehovah's Witnesses had ever engaged in violence or actual extremism. The government's representatives simply repeated their earlier arguments about extremist literature and the supposed dangers posed by the organization. The appellate judges reviewed the case, and then delivered their verdict. Appeal denied. The ban was confirmed. The decision was now final and could not be appealed further within the Russian legal system. This was it. This was the end of any legal avenue for reversing the ban through Russian courts. The only remaining option would be to appeal to international tribunals, particularly the European Court of Human Rights, but that process would take years and there was no guarantee of success. 1 month later, on August 17, 2017, the Russian government took the final administrative step. The Ministry of Justice officially added Jehovah's Witnesses to the federal list of extremist organizations. This list, which can be found on the ministry's website, typically includes terrorist groups, neo-Nazi organizations, radical Islamist movements, and other entities that have engaged in violence or genuinely extremist activities. And now, next to these groups, appeared the name Jehovah's Witnesses. This official designation had profound implications. It meant that the ban was not just a court decision but a permanent classification in Russian law. It meant that anyone associated with Jehovah's Witnesses could now be prosecuted under anti-extremism statutes. It meant that the full weight of Russia's law enforcement apparatus, from the FSB to local police, could be brought to bear against witnesses. And perhaps most ominously, it meant that the persecution was about to intensify. You see, up until this point, the ban had been primarily legal and administrative. Kingdom halls were closed, properties were confiscated, the organization was dissolved. But individual witnesses, for the most part, had not yet faced criminal prosecution simply for practicing their faith. That was about to change. With the extremist designation in place, law enforcement agencies now had explicit authorization to go after not just the organization but individual believers. And they did so with a vengeance. If you were hoping that the international condemnation would lead to concrete action, you would be disappointed. Western governments issued statements. Human rights groups published reports. The United Nations expressed concern. But none of it translated into real pressure on Russia. There were no sanctions, no diplomatic consequences, no meaningful attempts to force Russia to reverse course. The persecution of Jehovah's Witnesses was condemned in press releases and then largely forgotten as the news cycle moved on to other crises. Meanwhile, in Russia, a new chapter of suffering began. Starting in late 2017 and accelerating through 2018, 2019, and beyond, Russian authorities launched a systematic campaign of arrests, raids, and prosecutions. The pattern became grimly familiar. Police, sometimes accompanied by FSB agents and sometimes wearing masks and carrying automatic weapons, would raid private homes in the early morning hours. They would break down doors, terrorize families, confiscate phones and computers, seize religious literature, and arrest anyone suspected of organizing or participating in religious meetings. The targets were not violent criminals. They were often elderly men and women whose only crime was gathering with fellow believers to study the Bible. They were mothers and fathers who were arrested in front of their terrified children. They were people who had never broken any law, who had no criminal records, who posed no threat to anyone. But under Russia's extremism law, they were now criminals. And the penalties were severe. Some of those arrested were held in pre-trial detention for months, sometimes years, in Russia's notoriously harsh prison system. Conditions were brutal. Overcrowding, inadequate medical care, violence from other inmates. Some reported being tortured, subjected to physical abuse and psychological pressure to renounce their faith. Others were placed under house arrest, forbidden from leaving their homes except for approved activities, effectively imprisoned without even the meager protections of a jail cell. The trials, when they finally happened, were travesties of justice. The evidence presented was often laughable. Prosecutors would play recordings of religious meetings, pointing to prayers and Bible discussions as proof of extremist activity. They would present copies of Watchtower magazines as evidence of spreading extremist literature. They would call neighbors as witnesses who would testify that the defendants seemed like a cult or that they had refused to participate in patriotic holidays. The defendants would try to explain their beliefs, to demonstrate that they were peaceful and law-abiding, to show that their faith teaches love and compassion. It didn't matter. The verdicts were predetermined. The sentences varied, but they were always severe. Some received heavy fines that wiped out their life savings. Others were sentenced to years of restricted freedom, a form of probation that required constant reporting to authorities and restrictions on travel and association. And some, particularly those identified as leaders or organizers, received actual prison sentences. 2 years, 4 years, 6 years. In some cases, 7 years or more in a penal colony for the crime of worshiping their God. The human cost of this persecution is difficult to fully capture in statistics, though the numbers are staggering. By 2020, more than 400 individuals had been criminally charged. Dozens were in prison. Hundreds more were under investigation or facing charges. Thousands had fled the country, abandoning their homes, their jobs, their lives in Russia to escape persecution. Families were torn apart. Children grew up with parents in prison or in exile. The elderly, who had already endured Soviet-era persecution, found themselves once again targeted by the state for their faith. But beyond the numbers were the individual stories of suffering. There was the case of Dennis Christensen, a Danish citizen arrested in May 2017 and sentenced to 6 years in a penal colony, becoming the first witness imprisoned under the new ban. There was Valentina Baranovskaya, a 65-year-old woman detained in a prison cell so cold that she developed severe health problems. There were the mass raids in places like Surgut, where dozens of witnesses were arrested simultaneously in coordinated operations that looked more like anti-terrorism raids than religious persecution. There were reports of torture, of witnesses being stripped naked, beaten, subjected to electric shocks, and threatened with worse if they didn't renounce their faith. And through it all, the world largely looked away. Russia's persecution of Jehovah's Witnesses became a footnote in international news, mentioned briefly when a particularly egregious case came to light, then forgotten again as other stories dominated the headlines. The suffering continued in silence, witnessed only by those experiencing it and by a God they believed was watching. Here's what's crucial to understand. The ban in 2017 was not the end of the story. It was not even the climax. It was merely the legal framework that enabled everything that came after. The real story, the story that continues to unfold to this day, is the story of how Russia has used that framework to wage an increasingly aggressive campaign against a peaceful religious minority. With each passing year, the persecution has grown more sophisticated and more severe. Law enforcement agencies have developed specialized units focused on hunting down witnesses. They use surveillance technology, informants, and infiltration tactics typically reserved for serious criminal organizations. They monitor social media, track phone calls, and follow individuals suspected of continuing to practice their faith. The goal is not just to prosecute those who are caught, but to create an atmosphere of fear and paranoia that prevents witnesses from gathering at all. The legal proceedings have become more theatrical and more punitive. Prosecutors increasingly seek longer prison sentences, arguing that witnesses represent a serious and ongoing threat to Russian society. Judges, who are ultimately accountable to the political authorities that appointed them, have shown little sympathy for religious freedom arguments. Defense lawyers who take on these cases sometimes face harassment and professional consequences themselves. The entire system is designed to produce convictions and to send a message that there is no mercy for those who defy the ban. International efforts to help Russian witnesses have had mixed results at best. Some countries have granted asylum to those who manage to escape, recognizing them as religious refugees. The European Court of Human Rights has taken on several cases, though its rulings have done little to actually change Russia's behavior. Human rights organizations have documented the abuses in extensive reports, providing detailed accounts of arrests, trials, and prison conditions. But Russia, increasingly isolated from the West and increasingly authoritarian in its domestic policies, has shown no inclination to back down. If anything, the persecution has become more brazen, more public, more unapologetic. And this raises a deeply troubling question. If Russia can ban an entire religion, confiscate its properties, and imprison its members without meaningful consequences, what's to stop them from doing the same to other groups? The answer, as we've seen in recent years, is nothing. The ban on Jehovah's Witnesses has become a template. Other religious minorities, from certain Muslim groups to Protestant churches that refuse to submit to state control, have faced increasing pressure. The message from the Kremlin is clear. Your faith exists at our pleasure. Your freedom is conditional. Your rights can be revoked whenever we decide you've become inconvenient. This is why the story of what happened in 2017 matters. It's not just about one religious group in one country. It's about the broader question of whether religious freedom still means anything in an increasingly authoritarian world. It's about whether the international community will stand up for fundamental human rights or whether we'll continue to issue statements of concern while doing nothing of substance. It's about whether we recognize the danger in allowing governments to criminalize belief. The banning of Jehovah's Witnesses in Russia didn't fall from the sky. It was planned. It was constructed. And it was executed with surgical precision. First, they silenced the voice by blocking the website and cutting off communication channels. Then they attacked the organization through years of inspections, legal proceedings, and administrative harassment. And finally, they criminalized the faith itself, transforming believers into extremists with the stroke of a pen. 2017 is the year of the explosion, the moment when all the accumulated pressure finally detonated into open persecution. But the sparks began much earlier, in 2014 and even before, in the gradual tightening of religious freedom laws and the increasing alignment of church and state. And the fire continues to burn today, consuming lives, destroying families, and demonstrating what happens when a government decides who can believe and who cannot. Because when a government claims the authority to determine which faiths are acceptable and which must be eliminated, freedom doesn't disappear all at once. It dies slowly, incrementally, one ban at a time, one arrest at a time, one unjust verdict at a time. And unless we pay attention, unless we speak out, unless we recognize the danger, we risk waking up one day in a world where freedom of conscience exists only in history books, remembered as something humanity once valued but ultimately failed to protect. The story of what Russia did to Jehovah's Witnesses is not just their story. It's a warning. It's a test. And so far, the world has failed it.